Hi, welcome to Tradition Today. I'm Father David Smith. We're shooting Tradition Today from beautiful Highland Forest Park in Fabius, New York, part of the wonderful system of county parks in Onondaga County. And we're starting tonight a four-part series on the subject of the will of God. This is a complicated issue sometimes for a lot of people. But it's important, I think, for us to look at this subject while we have time. Look at the subject before it becomes important for us to look ahead and try to figure out what the will of God is for us in a particular situation, or before we encounter some tragedy in our lives that makes us question the will of God and question what it is that God wants of us and what He's doing. So we're starting tonight on the issue of the will of God, and I want to start with a story. I'll carry this story throughout our the four parts of this series. The story starts with a telephone call I received one night. A man called me up and told me that his brother had died in an accident in Hawaii. My first reaction was to say that I didn't know he had a brother. This man, the one who called me, was a part of my parish, not in Utica, it was in another city. He was a part of my parish and was very active, but the rest of his family was not. His parents, his wife's parents, and so on were not active at all in the church. And so, as I say, the first thing I said to him was, I didn't know you had a brother. And he told me that yes, he did. So I went over to his house, as I do in such circumstances, and I found out that his brother was 21 or 22 years old, was a very interesting guy. He was kind of a free spirit. When he was in high school, he would often get little odd jobs, sort of carpentry jobs, especially around the area where his parents had a camp. And he became very, very good at it, very good at carpentry, and pretty soon everybody wanted him. And so when he graduated from high school, what he would do is from late spring, he would start working on these camps, and he would take jobs doing carpentry work, and he became very, very skilled at it. And he would do that until sometime in the fall, the late fall, and then he would stop working for the rest of the year. And he would spend the winter being a ski bum, or maybe traveling and things like this. And he would live at his parents' camp up in this sort of remote area. He did that for the year when he was 18, when he was 19, 20, 21, and so on. And his mother started to say to him, I'm real proud of you. I'm proud of the work that you do. I'm proud of the reputation that you have, and so on. But I'd really like to see you settle down sometime. Go to college, get married, start a family, and start a career and things like this. And his mother kept asking him, when are you going to settle down? When are you going to go to school? Because his brother, the one who was a member of my parish, he had done very well in school, and he had a very nice job. He was a computer programmer. And this young man had finally decided that, yes, he was going to go to college, and he was going to settle down a little bit, that he had sort of sown his wild oats. And the one thing that he said to his mother, he had enrolled in a college, and he was getting ready to go in the fall. This was during the summertime when I got this call. He had said to his mother that he wanted kind of one last hurrah. He was going to go to Hawaii with a group of his friends, and they were going to sort of enjoy the last part of summer, their last summer together and things like that, before they all went back to school, or went to school. While he was in Hawaii, they were hiking up a mountain. And as they were hiking up the mountain, the young man who died, he he said that he wanted to go up to a ridge that was some distance away and get a picture of the sun, right where the sun was at that moment. The rest of the group that was with him, they were traveling rather slowly. So he said he was going to go on by himself. He was going to run up there and take the picture, and they could see the ridge from where they were. He says, I'll be up there. When you get up there, I'll meet you up there, and then we can, get back together. And so his friends said fine, and he took off running, and they continued to hike along. Well, they arrived at that ridge about a half an hour later, and they couldn't find him. And they looked and they looked and they looked, and after a while they did find him. The trail kind of went along the mountain, and then there was a little incline and a little flat area down at the bottom there, and they found him down at the bottom. They found his body. He had slipped down and cut open his leg on one of those sharp pieces of lava rock, and more than cut open his leg, gashed open his leg, and had fallen down the hill and had bled to death, really in a matter of minutes. The cut was rather high up on his leg and very deep. It was obvious that he had taken off his shirt and he had tried to make a tourniquet, but had been obviously unsuccessful. So they wrapped up his body and they took it back down the mountain and called his mother, and his mother called his brother, and his brother called me. So I sat with his brother a little while, and we were talking about this and so on and so forth, and he said to me, one of the things he said to me was, I'd like you to go see my mother. She doesn't have a church, she doesn't go to church or anything like that, but she prays and she reads the Bible, and I think it would be helpful if you went over there. So I went over to the house, and we talked for quite a long time. And as we were talking, one of the things she said was, I prayed that God would protect him during his trip, but apparently it wasn't God's will. Now, do you hear what she said? I prayed that God would protect him during that trip, but apparently it wasn't God's will. Now, what I'm about to say to you, I didn't say to her. I'm not going to start trying to teach somebody whose son has just died, especially at such a tragic part of his life, when he's just about to embark on his future, and so to speak, and then he's cut off. I'm not about to sit down and say to this woman, well, actually, I've written a teaching on the will of God, and so let me give you my 3 points. I'm not going to say that. We just talked a little bit more and prayed together and so on and so forth. But I do say that it is important for you and I to look at the will of God and to think about it now before any tragedies occur, so that when they occur, we are better prepared, really, to understand what has happened. Okay, she says to me that she prayed that he would be protected on his trip, but apparently it wasn't the will of God. Well, as I thought about that, as I was driving home that night, I thought to myself, well then, what would have happened if he would have come home safely? If he would have come home safely, would that be against the will of God? Or perhaps, what would have happened if the tourniquet would have worked? Because his friends who found him said that he had the tourniquet and he knew what he was doing. He was a real outdoorsman. And he had a stick in it. And he was apparently had been trying to twist the stick, the way you do that tightens the tourniquet, that prevents that stops the flow of blood. Apparently he had all of that in place, but didn't have the time or the energy to twist it. What if he had twisted it? Would that have been thwarting the will of God? Would God have been up in heaven looking down and saying, oh, darn, I wanted him to die and he's figured out that tourniquet thing. I wish I never would have invented them. Or to make it even more complex, what would have happened if a couple years later one of his friends came to the mother and said, "You know, I can't carry the guilt anymore. We killed your son. We cut his leg with a knife and threw him down a hill and waited for him to bleed to death." Would she still say, well, apparently it was his time. Apparently his time was up, you know? Or what would she say? Would she decide at that point that it hadn't been the will of God? That she's no longer mad at God, but she's mad at the friend? Or what would she say in terms of the will of God at that point? So basically what I'm asking when I talk about this woman and the sentence that she said during this time of grief is, what do we mean when we say the will of God? As I look in scriptures, and as I have talked to people throughout my life as a pastor, not only people who are looking ahead to the future and wondering what the will of God may be for them, but also people who are looking backward in time and saying, how could God have allowed such and such to happen? As I have done that, as I have thought about those things, I think there are really three ways of looking at the will of God or defining the will of God. I think and those really at times are almost contradictory. It's almost like we really can't say the will of God without defining exactly what we mean. We can say the will of God in a particular way, that is the will of God for you, the will of God for me, the will of God for everybody, every single person in the world. We can say that there is a general will of God, and that is the will of God for the world as a whole, for everybody that's in the world. Or we can say the will of God, the eternal will of God. This is the third kind of way of describing the will of God. In other words, when we say will of God, we're oftentimes either looking forward to the future and wondering what the will of God might be, or looking backwards and wondering how something that happened reveals the will of God. But also there is a will of God that stands outside of time, that isn't bound by time at all. It's the eternal will of God. The will of God not only for you and me and all of humanity, but for reality and time itself. So what does it mean when people say, like this woman said, I think it was the will of God that a tragedy happened to me? Well, first of all, I think that one thing is that she just doesn't understand, which makes sense. How can you understand that your 22-year-old son, who is, standing on the edge of a wonderful future, is killed in this very odd accident? Well, she doesn't understand that, but nor does she want to make God angry. And so she says, God, it's okay. He died, but I'm going to be fine, And what is she really saying? She's really saying, don't do anything mean to me. Don't do anything bad to me anymore. Don't take anything more away from me. Why don't you just leave me alone? Because she doesn't understand. I think for other people, I think when they say the will of God in that way, that they're really saying that they don't believe in God at all. Because how can there be a God? How can God desire that a young man like that would die? How can God make that part of his will? How could he make a lot of the things that happen in the world part of his will? And yet for a lot of people, anything can happen, and they'll say, it's the will of God. God must have wanted that to happen. How can we say that about abortion? Can we say that's the will of God? Well, no, we can't say that's the will of God, but God doesn't prevent it, somebody might say. Well, if God doesn't prevent it, then in some way it is his will. But how can we say that that's the will of God? You see, I think that when people get into that tangle of thinking that basically they're saying they don't believe in God at all, because a person, and God is a person, who has no will at all, or a will that is as inexplicable and unfathomable as that is, really is not a person at all. If I'm the pastor of my church and I'm sitting in my office and all of these terrible things are happening in my parish and things are falling apart and people are arguing and so on and so forth, and I'm just sitting in my office going, yeah, well, that's fine, that's okay, yeah, that's just what I want to have happen, yep, yeah. I mean, I'm not really a pastor. Just the same way that we can say that God really doesn't even exist if we're going to say that every single thing happens is part of His will. So, this is why I think it's very important for us to take a look at the will of God now, the particular will of God, the general will of God, and the eternal will of God. For us to think about this now so that we're not saying things that expose a heart that really doesn't believe in God or is afraid of God, is afraid that the things that God might do to them. Now, as I'm talking about this issue, there are some people who are going to say that we need to look in the book of Job to know about the way the will of God works. And that is to say that in the book of Job, you have, at the beginning of the book of Job, you have God sitting in heaven, and Satan comes walking along. And God says to Satan, Satan, take a look at Job. He's my servant. He'll do anything for me. He really loves me. And Satan, being Satan, says, he just loves you because you've given him all that money and this great family and all that stuff you've given him. That's the only reason he loves you. And God says, okay, you could take that stuff away from him and he would still love me. And Satan says, well, let me do it. And God says, okay, Satan, you can take his stuff away. And so Satan goes and he takes away his wealth, takes away his family, takes away his health. And then you get the bulk of the book of Job, which if you've ever read this ancient poem, it's a beautiful, beautiful book. The bulk of the book, which is Job sitting there and he's lost everything and he's in agony because of a skin disease. And he's sitting there thinking about God, thinking about God's will. Why did God do this to me? And he has these friends that are there who are urging him to repent for some evil that he's done. You must have done something wrong to deserve God's wrath like this. And Job is saying, no, I didn't do anything wrong. And they're saying, you must have, and so on and so forth. And you get that whole book going along. Well, what happens, I think, is that some people look to the beginning of that book as an explanation for why it is that some bad things happen. You know, we could say that this young man fell down a hill, a little incline in Hawaii, and cut open his leg, and he bled to death, and that wasn't the will of God, but God allowed it to happen. So it's just like the book of Job, where God says to Satan, Satan, go ahead and cause some trouble, and you'll see that my servant loves me. There's a lot of problems with saying that. Number one, this young man died, and Job does not die. Of course, we could be talking about the young man's mother. The young man's mother does not die, and her son dies, who's taken away, like Job's children are taken away. If you remember, Job has all these children at the beginning of the book, and they're all killed. And then later on, at the end of the book, he gets new children again. You know, the first time I read the book of Job, that was the only thing that was on my mind. As I read through the whole book, and I said to myself, what is this book saying? What's the scripture saying? That he had 12 children at the end of the book, and they replaced the other children? Like he didn't really care anymore about those other children that he had lost? You know, either the scriptures are weird or Job is weird. But something's weird in the idea that you can kill children, and then later on, it's like Bill Cosby says, boy, you don't behave me, I made you, I'm going to kill you and make another one. That's not the way that it works. But you know what? That's not the real, that's not the point of the book of Job. And nor is it the point of the book of Job that Satan gets permission every once in a while to come and give you grief, or give me grief, so that God can prove how much we love him. No, 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 no. That's not what we are to gain from the book of Job. What we are to gain from the book of Job is faithfulness in God. Don't look just at the beginning of the book, but look at the whole thing. Look at the end of the book. What happens at the end of the book is God comes down and appears and it says to Job, Job, you have spoken properly about me. And he says to the people who were talking to Job, you were not speaking properly about me. Because I am not simply someone, I am not someone who punishes you for evil in that particular way. I am not someone like that, but I am God, and you cannot question what I do. You see, it's God appearing to Job, and then, of course, restoring Job. He restores Job's health, he restores Job's family, he restores Job's wealth. That's the key of the book of Job. So I don't want anybody to think that when a tragedy happens to them, that this means that God has said to Satan, or God has said to the devil, you know what, go down and cause a little bit of trouble and see how much people love me. I'm being tested, some people will say. I'm being tested by God to strengthen me, to see how much I love him. That's not what God does. That's not the way that works. As we seek the will of God in all things, I pray that you do, and I pray that I do as well. And I hope that part of the will of God is that you would join us again next week for Tradition Today.
St. Tikhon's has always been one of the centers of the church. We have different kind of services that we offer, not only through the liturgy, like we say that is celebrated every day, but also through the work at the seminary that the monks have been doing since the inception of the seminary in 1938, when it was founded by Archbishop Arseny, the builder of the monastery. Also, the monks also travel. Some of them do give lectures and give retreats. For many years I traveled with the mission choir, raising funds for the seminary. Also, the monks are involved in different work of kind of upkeep, keeping our repositories and our museums clean, and making sure that the icons are in good shape, and that we're kind of caretakers of all the treasures that St. Tikhon's has. There's so many different kind of cultural and historical monuments that we house here at the monastery. That work is very difficult sometimes, just to kind of the upkeep of the property. We have almost 300 acres. It's not exclusively the monasteries, but it's shared by the monastery and the seminary. So the upkeep of a couple hundred acres of land is very difficult, and all the things that are housed thereon. Monasticism in general for the Orthodox Church is at the forefront of the spiritual battle. It's the front runner of the spiritual life in the church. It kind of plows the way for the rest of the people, the laity and the priests doing the work. The monastics are doing the battle on the spiritual level, whereas sometimes the priests and the laity do more of the physical battling for the kingdom, where they set up churches, whereas a monk, his entire work is consecrated to prayer. And it's through the prayers of the saints and through the monastics who offer their life in sacrifice to the Lord that the Lord bestows his benediction and his blessing upon the work that is done by everybody else. So really, monasticism here is exemplified through the liturgical life that we have here and through the daily life of prayer that each monastic has in his own cell. The liturgy has been celebrated here almost daily since 1905, so for almost 105 years. The liturgy has been offered up, and it becomes a real source of power. There's such a kind of forward movement of strong, powerful spiritual energy that's blessing and benefiting all America. This kind of power and strength that comes from the prayers here is incalculable, and it's inestimable. The value of it is hard to understand, but really when we begin to understand it, we begin to really kind of tap into the mystery of the spiritual world, which is present among us, but the effects often are not always seen immediately. More recently, we've been involved in work with a candle factory. We have our own candles now that we're offering, hand-dipped 100% beeswax candles that we're offering for the church in America to use for worship. Those are available at the bookstore. Well, St. Tikhon's, we have our own hives, so we produce quite a bit of honey. A monastery is often kind of akin to a hive, because there's always so much activity. So usually when we see maybe different bees kind of gathering, just kind of spontaneously creating a hive at a monastery, which has happened, I've seen before at different monasteries, it's a very good sign. It's a sign of God's blessing upon the monastery. Because of course bees are such hard workers, and also there's a sweetness there that comes from their work that we partake of. We've also been doing more work in the bookstore lately with getting some of the publications back on the shelves, doing some different writings, eventually going to be publishing some more work, some new work, some much needed work in the area of translation and anthologies. We publish CDs. We're in the middle of doing different kind of music projects right now with the Orthodox two-part music. There's a website that's available, orthodox2partmusic.org, and all the CDs that go along with that, we're in process with that. So the activities of the monastery are varied, and there's many of them that go on. We also have a parish here. The parish has been here since the monastery's been here, so we have parishioners. We have different hierarchical events that happen here, whether it's the Holy Synod meetings occasionally, or different conferences that the seminary and monastery either puts on or supports or helps with. So the work here is great, and the need is great as well for people to come to help, not only with their hands, but also through their prayers, through their donations, and through people actually coming and living here and giving their lives here as monastics and teachers and workmen in the Lord's vineyard at St. Tikhon's. We recently remodeled some of our houses to enable us to house visitors. These guest houses are open to the general public. Everybody is welcome to come to the monastery to visit for several days if they wish. They just have to contact us by phone or by email, and we are open to their visit, and we'd be glad to have anybody come to visit with us and stay with us, and to find a greater closeness to the Lord, and to really experience the monastery as it is on the inside.